Thank you all. Glad you came out on a nice summery fall evening. Here's the deal. Emily talks about the Heritage Center and the Washington County Historical Society. And I just really encourage you, if you are not a member, it's not a bad thing to do. You will find all kinds of fun things to do all around Washington County, this building, so many other, the Warden's house, other places. You get a newsletter, and it's just fun to know about the county you live in and all the history that goes with it. It's fascinating. So here's the deal. You see three pictures up here of books. This is the only advertisement I'm going to give, okay? And this is a deal. This is my Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling book. It's all about the A.W.A, cover to cover. It is here available for sale. Now here's the deal on the book. You turn the cover over, it says $29.95 on the back. If you go to Barnes & Noble or any bookstore, that's what it is. They are here tonight for $25. And you don't have to pay sales tax, and then it would be $32 at Barnes & Noble, okay? So $25. But if you buy it, 100% of that $25 goes to the Heritage Center, to the Washington County Historical Society. So you're making a donation here. I'm not getting the money, okay? And they haven't paid me for these books. Let's just make that clear, okay? The other book here, this is a results book. This will tell you everything, every wrestler, every card for the 60s that worked around the A.W.A, the entire circuit, other cities, other towns, states. You'll see where your favorite wrestlers were on the card, top, bottom, in the middle, when they lost, when they won, little things about feuds. That's for the 60s. We've got the 70s part 1, which is 74 to 7 or 70 to 74. And then there's another one, part 2, 75 to 79. These sell for $20. However, because I like you, they're $10 tonight. And again, 100% of that $10 goes to the History Center. So that's my plug. Be a member, pay for a membership, or be happy to get a book and make a donation to the History Center. Okay, guys? All right. We're done.
Great. Great.
All right. Thank you for coming. I look at the ages, and I know that we got some older fans here. And one of the things that always fascinated me from a little kid on was tag team wrestling. And very short, my very first live wrestling card that I remember was in August of 1957. I went with my dad, and the main event was a tag team bout, which unusual at this time because they didn't always match good guys and bad guys. Normally it was good guys, bad guys. But on this particular night, it was 2 bad guy tag teams, and they were battling for local supremacy. Now, the real catch to the thing is that on one team, it was Mitsu Arakawa and Kenji Shibuya, the Japanese team. And I always remind people that in that era, this was right after World War II, about 8 years after World War II. And the program read Dirty Japs, because we weren't politically correct. And remember, Japanese was our enemy after World War II. So they were one side, and the other side were Ivan and Karol Kelmakov, the Russians. So you have the dastardly Russians in here, the garlic-eating Russians. It talks in the story on my program. Well, they were going to go against each other in a tag team bout, and I was learning about tag teams. First of all, let me tell you that tag team wrestling originated in the United States back about 1936. Promoters were smart. They figured out that if we put a good guy and a bad guy against each other, or 2 bad guys against each other, or 2 good guys against each other, we're going to have a lot of action. But if we put 2 guys on each side, we double the fun and the chaos. And you have to remember that the rules were always made to be broken. You had to break the rules to have the fun. So when you have a tag team, you'd have 2 guys on one side, 2 guys on the other side. And the origination of the tag team, originally, stories will tell you that they call them Australian tag team matches. Now, no proof has ever been made that they originated in Australia, but that's what they've always been called. And the original thing was in the ring corner where the turnbuckle is, there was a rope, a tag rope. And the guy outside the ring, the partner, had to hold on to that tag rope, thus tag team. And in order to get into the ring to relieve his partner, the rule said he had to tag off to his partner to get into the ring. Same for the other side. Well, ironically, When the bad guys would get in the ring and be double teaming the poor good guy, the referee would be trying to stop this good guy from coming in because he's not tagged holding the rope. So meanwhile, his buddy gets beat up. It just works out that way. And the fans are seeing this happen and the referee's blind. He was doing his job. So back to that 57 match. The Japanese against the Russians. There's about 4,000 people at the old St. Paul Auditorium. This is before the Excel. This is before the Civic Center. This was the old St. Paul Auditorium. In my little 6-year-old mind at that time, that tells you I'm 106 now, okay? My little 6-year-old mind, I looked around and I thought everybody in the world is here. Because you got to remember when you're 6 years old, your population is the school you go to, your classroom, and the people you live on. That's it. When the Russians came out and were introduced, the fans booed so loud, I was holding my ears. And when the Japanese came out and Marty O'Neill introduced them, the fans booed. And it seemed like it was louder. And I said to my dad, why are they booing both teams? And he goes, I hope they just kill each other. My dad says this. And what happened was, mark that guy Tardy. Just kidding. My dad says he just hoped they killed each other. Well, the deal was, and I never understood this until later on, wrestling promoters played off of the emotions of the fans. So remember, the Japanese were our enemies, and so they were hated by Americans. And of course, the Russians, they weren't any good for us. So you booed them. And my dad said when he wanted them all killed. Now, here was the beauty of it. I had to learn this later on. When one of the Japanese hit a Russian, the fans cheered. And when one of the Russians hit a Japanese, the fans cheered. They really wanted them just to destroy one of them. So that was my first thing on tag teams, and I really loved it. So as we proceeded to go through the 50s, we get, this was in 57, so we had 2 more years, and Vern Gagne, everybody recognize that name, one of the greatest amateur professional wrestlers ever, he bought the Minneapolis territory, which is what it was called. And it was later became the A.W.A. But the Minneapolis territory promoted matches here in Minnesota, Winnipeg, Denver, Omaha, Nebraska, Iowa, Chicago, all over. He bought into it. And then in 1960, when he changed the name of the company to the A.W.A., American Wrestling Alliance, later it became association, but it was alliance. The first thing he had to do was come up with some tag team champions. And so the whole thing about a territory is you're going to have people that have to shoot for something. They want to go for something. What are they fighting for? You got to have a champion. Well, ironically, in 1959, we had a tag team come here. One of the gentlemen was from here, and the other one was from Alberta, Canada. And you can put that picture up right now, the first one. So we get Tiny Mills and Stan Kowalski. And Stan Kowalski was a Minneapolis guy. Stan Crusher Kowalski, he was Crusher with a K, not a C. And Tiny Mills. The deal with them was they had legitimately traveled all over the United States. They had been to Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and they were team. And what happened was they ended up being recognized in what they called at the time international tag team champions. So they had returned home to Minneapolis, and Vern, starting the new company, needed to have champions. So by default, in their international tag team ranking, he named them the very, very first A.W.A. tag team champions. Now, here's the funny part. Tiny Mills was about 10 years older than Stan at the time. And Tiny would have been at this time right around 40-ish in 1960, maybe 40, a little over 40. And he was really starting to slow down his career. So shortly after Vern put the title on them, Tiny wanted to slow down, and Vern had to come up with new champs. So he goes to October, only 2 months after they were named champs, and he had them lose in one of those, again, kind of weird, bad guy versus bad guy tag team matches. And he had them go against, next picture, Hard-Boiled Haggerty and Len Montana. Now, Len Montana, I will tell you, for you Godfather movie fans, is it Luca Brasi? I never know how to pronounce it, but that's who Len Montana was. He played in the Godfather movies. And he had some other movie roles later on as well. And so did Hard-Boiled Haggerty later on in his career. But this was the ideal team to take that title from Mills and Kowalski. Well, wouldn't you know, we get about 6 months down the road, and Marty O'Neill tells us that Len Montana is out of action with a broken leg. That's what we were told on TV. And of course, Haggerty is champion with him at this time. So the A.W.A. agrees that they will let Haggerty pick a partner. And that's the next picture that Emily's going to share with us. He picked Gene Kiniski out of Canada as his new partner. But let me just tell you that what we were told about Len Montana wasn't really what happened. He had a beef with Vern Gagne and Wally Carbo behind the scenes, and he left. So his leg wasn't really broken. All of a sudden, I had some wrestling programs showing him down in Tampa, Florida. So I guess you can't wrestle with a broken leg. But they were the new tag team. And they were extremely bad guys. Well, what happened here is Gene Kiniski was feuding with Vern Gagne. Gagne was individual champion, A.W.A. champion, and Gene wanted the title shot. And their feud went on, and eventually they ended up in a cage match out at the old Metropolitan Stadium. Haggerty was at ringside outside the cage area, of course, to second his partner, Gene. Well, wouldn't you know that during the course of the match, Gene had Vern down on close to the ring apron and where Haggerty was standing, and Haggerty picked up some dirt from the baseball field, and he was going to throw it at Vern Gagne. And amazingly, Vern ducked. And Gene got it in the face, and Vern put the sleeper on him and ended Gene Kiniski's match. And Gene Kiniski was livid. His partner, he felt he did it on purpose. So I didn't do it on purpose. Well, yes, you did. So guess who's feuding? The tag team champions. They're against each other now. So the A.W.A. had another problem. What are we going to do? Well, they each hold a part of the title. So Wally Carbo says, Haggerty, you will wrestle Kiniski in a singles match. And whichever of you wins, you get to choose a partner, and you will become the A.W.A. tag team champions. And so you can, did you slip one?
Sorry, I thought that was the.
Go back, number 3. Oh, okay.
There you go.
There you go. All right.
Technical.
Maybe I put them out of order. Okay,
I'm not sure.
never mind. I'm on. Before they broke up, they had a feud with the picture you're going to put that picture up.
Next one.
There you go. They had a feud with Wilbur Snyder, very popular good guy, and Leo Namalini, who was a great football player. He was a Minnesota Gopher back in his day, but he played for the San Francisco Giants, and he would wrestle on the offseason. And he and Snyder, for a very, very brief time, won the title from Haggerty and Kiniski before they broke up. And then Haggerty and Kiniski took it back because Namalini went back to football. And that ended that. So now you can show the next picture. So Haggerty won over Gene Kiniski. And he picked Texas Bob Geigel as his partner. And Texas Bob Geigel, you'd be surprised to know, I don't know how a guy from Algona, Iowa becomes Texas Bob Geigel, but that was in wrestling, so it worked. But he was a great amateur wrestler as well. He was also in the Olympics. He and Vern Gagne behind the scenes were good friends. And he put the title on Haggerty and Geigel. Okay, go ahead. Now, what happened here is Haggerty wanted to be a singles wrestler. He really was tired of being in tag teams. So they lost the title to Pat Kennedy and Dale Lewis. The interesting thing about Pat Kennedy was I don't know if the AWA just didn't pay attention. His real name was, it won't matter to you, but his real name was Larry Helm. And he wrestled as Bobby Graham. He comes into the AWA and he was Bobby Graham on some cards. But then you'd go to the next city in the AWA and they would introduce him as Pat Kennedy. So he was having identity issues. But when they held the title, he was Pat Kennedy. And the reason he was being called Pat Kennedy, just a little trivia, is this was in November of 1961. And you will remember back in 61, we had a president by the name of John F. Kennedy. And that was Vern's way of kind of behind the scenes. They were brief champions. They ended up losing the title to, we're doing this different tonight because I'm making Emily work.
That's great.
They lost the title to Otto von Krupp and Texas Bob Geigel. Because remember, Haggerty wanted to be a singles wrestler. Well, here's the weird thing. Otto von Krupp, he was obviously a German, right? Well, he was until he left here and went down to Tampa and became a Russian, Boris Malenko. But the irony of it is that he was neither of those nationalities. He was Jewish. So his real name was Larry Simon. But during this little tenor here, they put the title belt on him, and Otto decided he wanted to leave. And that left the title kind of in limbo again. So it became vacant. In January of 1962, Vern decided he was going to hold a tournament to name new tag team champions. And he picked out Larry Hennig, who in those days was only wrestling for about 5 years, and he was a good guy, a baby face. Fans loved him. And he teamed up with a guy named Duke Hoffman. Vern billed them as the youngest tag team champions ever after they won an 8-team tournament in the St. Paul Auditorium. Their final match, they beat Vern Gagne and Leo Namalini in the final match and became champions. Ironically, as much as they touted them and they said they were the youngest champions in history, Vern failed to tell people that he had been here before wrestling as Bob Liebler and nobody recognized him. So fans either have short memories or they just forget, or I don't know. But they were champions for only a month. Now this was really weird because being champions for only a month and going through that long tournament process, logic would have said they would have been champions for a long time. You weren't going to go through all this 18 tournament. That's a tongue twister. So they lost the title. Next one. They lose it back to Bob Geigel, and there's our buddy Stan Crusher Kowalski. And they were champions. And ironically, their matches or their title reign was short. But here's what happened here. They didn't tell fans this, or they told fans this, but it's not what happened. Fans, Bob Geigel and Stan Kowalski lost the title in Cincinnati, Ohio on April 1st. They lost it to a brother tag team by the name of Art and Stan Nielsen. And the fun part of that is that they lied to us because they never lost the title. There was never a match. Art and Stan Nielsen were tag team champions in the Indianapolis territory. And Vern just decided that he would put the title on him. And strangely enough, Stan and Bob Geigel continued to wrestle here, but now they weren't champs. But here's where the problem came in. Vern was having trouble getting the Nielsen brothers to come in and wrestle on his cards because they were under the promotional banner of the Indiana office, which was the worldwide, or the World Wrestling Federation at the time, World Wrestling Alliance, excuse me. And Vern could never get him in. So all of a sudden he can't have title matches. So Vern decided he was going to take matters into his own hands and get his own champions back. And before I go with that, I just want to throw you a little bit of trivia. Stan Nielsen, earlier in his career, he was Stan Lisowski, and he was the brother to Reggie Lisowski, who later became the Crusher. So try to do their family tree. His real name was Stan Holland. But anyway, the Nielsen brothers. So Vern decided he was going to come up with a tag team of his own, and he was going to get his title back. He brought in this team right here. Go ahead, Emily. Mr. High, Mr. Low, Doug Gilbert, Dick Steinberg. Doug Gilbert, if anybody remembers him, he was a high flyer. He was off the turnbuckle ropes, doing somersaults, drop kicks. Dick Steinberg was more a mat wrestler, a little bit more closer to the mat. So that's where the Mr. High and the Mr. Low came in, and that's what they were building. Vern gave them, and when I say Vern, I'm talking Vern and Wally Carmel, but Vern behind the scenes, nobody knew it, he was the boss. In those days, he was just the champion wrestler, and nobody knew he was really the owner, okay? So Vern gave them a mega push for about 4 months. They beat many, many teams, and they were undefeated. The whole objective is that Vern was going to get them to the championship, which they did, and then put the next one up, Emily. We've got those dastardly Russians, Ivan and Kirill Kelbakov, that I mentioned to you a moment ago. And Doug and Steinborn, they won the title. They only held it for 2 weeks. Now that was weird because he had a 4-month push. They lost it after only 2 weeks. But the whole objective was to put them on a heel, the titles on a heel team, because then Steinborn and Gilbert could be the babyface challengers with the rationale that they beat them once, they could beat them again and be champions. So we had the Russians as tag team champions. And little trivia just quickly. Cheryl Kelmakov, by the way, they weren't real brothers. I know that's going to freak you out. Ivan Kelmakov was a guy named Ed Bruce from Detroit, Michigan. And Karol Kelmakov was a Polish wrestler. He's got a long, high chart last name. I can't pronounce it, but he was Karol. He also wrestled as Karol Klauser. But a little bit of secret trivia on him is that if any of you are old enough to remember the old, or have seen the old animated late 40s, 1940s Superman movie serials, Karol Kelmakov's body was used as the artist work for the Superman character in those shows. So he had a very good build in the younger days. Well, anyway, you got to beat the Russians. That was tough because America, USA. And Vern did really well with the Kelmakovs. But then Karol wanted to do some travel. So that was going to break up the team. We didn't know that on the outside. That's what was happening in the office. Karol was going to leave. So Ivan, he slowed down a little bit. And Vern had to get the title off of him. He didn't know what to do at first. Then he came up with an idea. The Crusher, who had become a #1 heel baby, or a #1 heel for Vern at the time, the Crusher said he would team up with his cousin, Dick the Bruiser. How about those two guys? And they weren't really cousins. Vern created that they were, because they looked alike. And they were bad guys, but he had another bad guy match with the Crusher and the Bruiser against the Kelmakovs. And I remember attending the second match between them in 1963. And the program read Battle of the Butchers. And then it was a pretty bloody affair for that night. But Crusher and Bruiser were the champions. So Crusher and Bruiser are champs. A little while later, Vern decides he's going to try for the title. He was using the angle where he wanted to be the first world champion to also hold the world tag team title. It's never been done before. And he teamed up with Moose Evans, Big Moose Evans. And they took the title for 2 weeks from Crusher and Bruiser. Now, the only reason they did this was for the purposes of building a rematch. Obviously, Crusher and Bruiser would want to get revenge. They claimed they were cheated out of it. You know, they're the bad guys. And Vern, he was doing it simply for that. I now also hold the tag team title gimmicks. So they lost it back. Now, what I'm not going to do here is I'm not going to show repeat champions, okay? So we know they lost it back to Crusher and Bruiser. In July of 1964, Vern Gagne is in a heated feud with the Crusher, the bad guy Crusher. They ended up having a loser leave the A.W.A match, and the Crusher left. He lost. Now, the whole thing behind the scenes was the Crusher needed a vacation. He wanted to take time off. He wasn't hurt. He just was taking time off. So obviously, let's have this loser leave town. So this is in July. Now we've still got Crusher and Bruiser as tag team champions. October comes along, and Vern hooks up, and you can do the next one. Vern hooks up Larry Hennig, who is now a bad guy. At least he should be, with a name calling himself Pretty Boy. And he teams up with handsome Harley Race. And Vern's idea was that eventually they would become his tag team champions. So we're in July of 64. They're together in October. So from October to December, they're undefeated. And they get into a battle with Vern Gagne and Reggie Parks as a team. Wilbur Snyder interferes in the match on behalf of Vern and Reggie. And so Hennig and Race say, you know what? If they want to have him interfere, we'll get a partner. In the meantime, they've been chasing Crusher and Bruiser, and Carbo has been telling them, we don't know where the Crusher is, and I don't know if we can sign the match. So finally, they come out with their surprise partner, and they're bragging that they have a coup. They have one half of the World Tag Team Champions, Dick the Bruiser, as their partner. And we have a six-man tag now. Well, during that tag, Hennig and Race are in the ring with the Bruiser, and they're not tagging off to it. Remember that tag rope I was telling you about earlier? The Bruiser's prancing along the ring apron, trying to get in. Hennig and Race won't tag to him. Finally, Bruiser had enough. He went in the ring, took them both by their hair. Wilbur Snyder fell on Larry Hennig for a 1-2-3. They had been beaten for the first time in fans' eyes. They're now living. They want to get that Judas, that Benedict Arnold, that Dick the Bruiser who turned on. Bruiser finally says, I'm going to find the Crusher. If I have to search every bar, every honky-tonk in Milwaukee, I'll find him, every saloon, okay? So he found the Crusher, wouldn't you know, a miraculous. Now we're into January of 65. In the first match, this is beautiful because Crusher and Bruiser are now still heels. Remember that. Of course, they're heels. And Wally Carbo says, we don't have a referee that can handle these guys unless we get Tiny Mills. You remember, we talked about Tiny Mills earlier. The king of the lumberjacks. He's the only guy big enough to handle these bullies. So Tiny's in the ring as the referee. Well, wouldn't you know, in the second fall, Tiny got knocked out, fell outside the ring. As he's going out, he hit his back. He couldn't continue as the referee. What are we going to do? We don't have a referee. The call went to the back. This is at the St. Paul Auditorium. Call goes to the back. Carbo comes out and says, none of the referees want to handle these guys. So guess who comes out? Vern Gagne. He's got his sport going on. He gets in the ring. He says, I'll referee this. Hennig gets upset because he doesn't like Gagne. Crusher is protesting because so both teams don't want Vern. Well, Vern's the ref. Well, as we go through the match, Vern ended up popping Hennig, causing him to lose. And then Vern and Hennig had a match in between, but then the Crusher and the Bruiser got back together and had another rematch with them because after all, it was because of Vern Gagne they didn't win. So on January 30th of 1965, Pretty Boy Larry Hennig, handsome Harley Race are the new World Tag Team Champions. Okay? Well, they got derailed. I'll just share this with you. They got derailed about a month later, very briefly. Harley Race was involved in a little confrontation in downtown Minneapolis at a lounge called the Chestnut Club after the matches. And there were three guys in there beating up on a lady patron. The manager came over to Harley Race, who was there, and asked if he might interject himself in this, being that he knew Harley was a wrestler. Harley went in, and this is true. This made the papers in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. Harley Race went in, took out one of the guys, took out the second guy, but he forgot about the third guy. And the third guy came up behind him and got him in the back with a knife. And Harley went down, went to the hospital. This was all in the newspapers. And they were really proclaiming Harley a hero because he had saved this lady from these bullies. So for about 3 weeks, Harley was out of action, which kind of put a kink in the title matches that Vern had signed up. But Larry had a substitute partner who was only billed as Masked Man. And it was a guy that was a lesser wrestler on the card, just put a mask on to take his place. Beautiful story about them. You don't know how hated they are. When you got two guys that are telling you that they're a pretty boy and they're handsome, that they have the faces of the goddess of love, that they have the bodies of Hercules and the mind of Einstein, you know, you automatically hate it. When Harley says, we have the bodies that men fear and women crave, you know they're going to be hated, right? So when Harley comes back after this knifing accident on All-Star Wrestling on TV, the very first match back, Marty O'Neill introduces him and the studio audience cheered Harley Race. They were really appreciative of the fact that he was a hero. Harley, the match started and Harley was the first one to start the match. And he immediately went out and he was clubbing his opponent. He was kicking him. Harley later said, and then they were booing him right there. 5 seconds into the match, they were booing Race. And Harley later said, he said, I knew I had to get my heat back. I can't be a babyface. So he did it. But that was a true story about that. So they were champions, but remember the Crusher still wants to get revenge because he and the Bruiser lost to these guys. The Bruiser was running his own promotion behind the scenes. Nobody knew this, and he was the boss in Indianapolis. And so he was basically unavailable to Vern. Well, what a great idea. Vern comes up in July of '65. He says, you know what? The Crushers now become kind of a hero to our fans because they love him. So Vern says, I'll team with the Crusher. Now you remember just a year earlier, they were enemies. Vern ran him out of town. Well, that was a great team up because fans are saying this can't happen because the Crusher, he doesn't like Vern Gagne. Is he going to turn on him? Can Hennigan Ray, you know, he's going to be in there with 3 people. But Crusher and Vern, they did it. They became the champs. This is a picture taken after they won in those days, they used both belts and they had trophies sometimes. But they were the champs and in the program. The only reason Vern did this was, again, they were to build up a rematch, to keep the heat on Hennig and Race. And 2 weeks later, Hennig and Race got their chance and they wrestled against Vern and Crusher and they won the title back. A little bit later, about a year later, we get into '66. And Hennig and Race were going to take a tour of Australia. Well, Vern's not going to have champions here. So he had them drop the title to Crusher and Bruiser for a short time. And Hennig and Race are on this tour of Australia and New Zealand. And they legitimately did go there. I have programs that show this. They were introduced as international champions in Australia. So they're gone for about 3 months. Crusher and Bruiser are champions. Hennig and Race come back. Now they want their title. They're going to try to beat Crusher and Bruiser, and they do. Okay, so now we're in 1967, pushing into '67, and you can show us this next picture. Something weird happened. In October of 1967, the Larry Hennig-Vern Gagne feud was still raging. Vern, I don't know if you guys remember, but Vern trained Larry for the professional ranks. They both were Robbinsdale High School graduates. And Larry was always the bad guy and Vern was the teacher. So Larry always wanted to beat his teacher. And Vern, on the other hand, would say, you know, Larry's jealous and he's immature, and that's the way their feud went. So they were in a singles match in, actually they weren't, I got to tell you the truth. Johnny Powers was a wrestler that was going to be leaving the A.W.A. And he had wrestled against Vern Gagne, and then Johnny Powers was done. So what happened is that Johnny Powers wrestled Larry Hennig before he left. And Larry Hennig had his leg broken in this match with Johnny Powers. That's in Winnipeg. But Johnny Powers was going to be gone, so it didn't do any good to give him credit for it. In the thing, to, the promoters thought to the fans, why should we give him credit for it? We'll tell him that Vern Gagne broke it. So Larry wanted to get revenge, but Larry was legitimately out of action. What happened was that Powers had caught him in the leg and twisted his knee, and he legitimately broke his knee. So Larry was out for 6 months. But what happened was that while he was out, Vern said, well, we need tag team champions. Again, that story. So he asked Harley Race to pick a partner. Of course, they knew they were going to pick Chris Markoff. And they were going to defend the title. And in their very first title defense in November of 1967 in Chicago, they lost to this team right here coming up. Wilbur Snyder again and Pat O'Connor. And they were the new champs. They beat Race and Markoff in Race and Markoff's first defense of the title. Wilbur Snyder and O'Connor, surprisingly, were only used as the interim champions, though, because Vern and Bruiser, in Bruiser's tearing, and Vern here in A.W.A, they decided they could use the same team as champions. Somehow Vern forgot that it didn't work with the Nielsen's years earlier. So Wilbur Snyder and Pat O'Connor a month later lost to the Japanese team, Mitsu Arakawa and Yamamoto. And we told you about Mitsu Arakawa, he'd been around for a long time. He was still a hated Japanese wrestler. And Dr. Moto was a wrestler who had wrestled in other territories as Tor Kamata. His real name was McRonald Kamata. I guess that goes together with Moto. But they were the champs for a whole year. And Vern had a chance to use them on his cards for some tag team defenses against guys like Billy Red Lions and Frankie Lane, and against Bill Watts and Rock Rogowski. But then they eventually, Vern decided, I can't share it with Bruiser anymore. We're still having these problems where I can't get them for my dates of Bruiser's. So they decided that Vern was going to have them beat, and he had them lose to the Crusher and the Bruiser again. Now, let me tell you a little story about Vern and going to the Crusher all the time. The Crusher, I mentioned earlier, had a loser leave town match. The thing with Crusher is that he didn't like being champion. He didn't want to have the titles. That may sound strange to you, but he didn't. The reason he didn't, because he could draw money without being champion. And the other thing was that he liked to take vacations. He just liked to leave the ring for 2 or 3 months. So in those times, we'd be told that in the case of the loser leave town, we don't know where he is. But other times the Crusher was injured and he couldn't wrestle. But in reality, he was probably sitting out on his deck, sipping a cold beer. So they lost to Crusher and Bruiser, and Vern just went to Crusher and said, we keep the title for a while. So Crusher and Bruiser were champs. That's why I'm not going to show them, because that's a repeat. But after about 8 months, there's a new tag team on the scene. Wasn't bad enough that we had Mad Dog Vachon from Algeria, who had feuded with Vern and had tag team matches and was the champion individually. He now brought in his little brother. Show the picture. His little brother, I don't think he's little. Mad Dog was certainly the shorter of the two. His little brother, Paul, Butcher Vachon. And Butcher was a legit wrestler that had never wrestled well. He wrestled here in 1958, but he was a Russian Nikolai Zolotov back then. But now he was Algerian. And he and Mad Dog were being touted as becoming champs. Can they win? They battled a lot of matches against Billy Red Lions and Red Bastille. And a lot of people always said, well, why didn't Vern put the title on Billy and Red? Because they were over with the fans. But the thing was, they made better challengers than they made champions. And they always lost because they did, the referee didn't see the tag, or he didn't see the pin, or he missed the foreign object, so The Vachons finally won the title from Crusher and Bruiser in August of 1969 on a big card in Chicago, and an outdoor card in Chicago's old White Sox Comiskey Park. And it was in a cage match. And ironically, when they won the title, it was so bad that they injured the Crusher fans. His back is bad. We don't know when he's going to be back. Behind the scenes, another Crusher vacation. So now they're champions from August to January. We're in January of 1970. And they've been running roughshod now for about 4 or 5 months. Who can beat them? Well, guess who came back after his injury? A Crusher. And he wanted the Dog, and he wanted the Butcher. So he had a match with Butcher first, a singles match. He beat him. He had a match with Mad Dog, a singles match, and he beat him. And now Crusher says, I want a title match. The Vachons said, no way, we're not going to defend the title to you. So they're in a TV studio match. The Vachon brothers are wrestling against normally what you call a jobber tag team, TV wrestlers. It was Bruce Kirk was the guy's name, and Edouard Carpentier, the Flying Frenchman. He was a big name at the time. During the course of the match,
Next one.
Pardon?
Next one.
No, you don't have to show that yet.
Okay.
During the course of the match on TV, Bruce Kirk is injured. And now Carpentier, oh my gosh, he's got to go it alone against the Vachons. Well, wouldn't you know, from behind the curtain comes out the Crusher, making his reappearance. The fans are protesting. Mad Dog is upset. Crusher gets in. They rip his clothes off of Crusher, his tearaway suit. I'm sure it was a tearaway suit. They ripped it off. They went outside the ring, and this was a legitimate injury, believe it or not, in wrestling. Crusher had taken Mad Dog and hit him a few times onto the table, and Crusher, or Mad Dog, was supposed to, they used to use these little tiny razor blades that cut their forehead. Okay. And then it would bleed. Well, Mad Dog was going to, Emma's getting sick.
Yeah.
Mad Dog was supposed to do this, and he did. And as he was doing it, Crusher hit his head on the table, the ringside table, and Mad Dog gouged himself. And this is on YouTube, folks. You can look this up, Crusher versus Mad Dog. He's in the ring, and Crusher is choking Mad Dog, and Mad Dog has blood just squirt. Watch it on YouTube, and we'll get on it. Squirting out. I don't think the Crusher understood the severity of it, but he had hit an artery. And Mad Dog was legitimately, and it was weird because Roger Kent, who was the ringside announcer, he literally went out of character and said, he's really hurt. We need help here. And Mad Dog was squirting the blood. They ended up taking her to the hospital. Now that night, the match was supposed to be Crusher against Mad Dog. They were going to have their singles match, but it wasn't going to take place because Mad Dog's injured. So the card was changed, and it was changed with a main event of Crusher teaming with Carpentier, and they went against Pretty Boy Larry Hennig and his new partner at the time, Luscious Lars Anderson. But that was establishing the team of Crusher and Carpentier. So now the Vachons are back, and they had a running feud with Crusher, along with Carpentier, and then Crusher with Vern Gagne again. They teamed up. And eventually we got to many, many other challengers. The Vachons held the title for the next few years. 1971, Butcher Vachon went to Vern Gagne and he said, we want to drop the titles because we're going to be going up to Montreal, Canada. And Butcher was starting a promotion along with Mad Dog, and they were going to run their own wrestling promotion up in Montreal. So Vern had to arrange for them to eventually lose the title. But before they did that, the Vachons were going to Japan. And Japanese fans always had the privilege of seeing American wrestlers come over and wrestle in Japan. They were going over to Japan, and before they did, they stopped for one match in Portland, Oregon, for a promoter by the name of Don Owen. Now, Don Owen was the guy that 10 years earlier had given Mad Dog his Mad Dog name. He was normal Maurice Vachon before that. And he had been in the ring and he was clawing and biting his opponent. And Don Owen said, I don't understand what's come over Maurice Vachon. He's in there clawing and gouging like a mad dog. And well, it stuck. So Mad Dog was good friends with Don Owen. So before they went to Japan, they went into Don Owen and they told him they'd do him a favor. It just so happened. Now remember, this isn't A.W.A territory. It just so happened that Don Owen wanted to get his tag team of Germans. And you can put that picture up. He had a German team called Kurt and Karl von Steiger. And Mad Dog was willing to put them over and let them win the tag team title in Portland. The reason he did it was because Kurt was a friend of Mad Dog's. His real name was Paul Caruso. I don't know if that's German. But Mad Dog agreed to do this for him and for promoter Don Owen. And then they took off for Japan. Now what it did for Don Owen was for 2 weeks while the Vachons were in Japan, his team was recognized, billed in the matches that they were working in the Pacific Northwest as A.W.A. World Champions. Weird as it sounds, Vern Gagne got hold of this information and he was ticked. He was mad at Mad Dog for doing this, but ironically, nobody ever knew about it because in that era, without the internet and the ability to find out what's going on across the street, nobody here ever knew anything of this. So the Vachons were in Japan as A.W.A. champions on behalf of Vern. When they came back, they again went through Portland. They wrestled the von Steigers in a rematch and took their title. And of course, when they got home here, they were champions again. Now, it did help Kurt and Karl von Steiger because they had a long career in the Pacific Northwest there. And that brief title really, made it good for them. Okay, so now we get to that Mad Dog and Butcher going to Vern and saying, I want to go to Montreal. So Vern had to come up with some champions. So he agreed that he would put the title on Red Bastien and Hercules Cortez. They were very popular babyface team. And they were going to take the title from the Vachons. They did take it from them on May 15th of 1971 in Milwaukee. The idea was that Bastien and Cortez were going to be champions for a couple of years. They always have this long-range plan where you want to maybe hold them for a couple of years. And the Vachons were gone. Well, May 15th to July, only 2 months in, something happened. On the morning of July 24th, 1971, that would be about 9 weeks since May 15th. Coming back from Winnipeg, Canada, Cortez and Bastien were driving, coming on 694, got near St. Cloud, the Rice, Royalton area, and Cortez lost control of his car. Car crashed, Cortez was killed. Bastien was in the front seat. He did get injured. He banged up his leg really bad, so he did have to take a little bit of time off. Well, what was happening that night on July 24th was Cortez was scheduled in a singles match to wrestle against Nick Bockwinkel in a battle billed as the Battle of the Unbeatens. Nick was the heel, Cortez was the good guy, and they were both unbeaten in their singles matches. And the idea was that the winner of the match would get a world title shot if So now Cortez is dead the day of the card. It happened in the morning hours of the 24th. Card is in the evening, 24th, at the Minneapolis Auditorium. So Vern agreed that he would wrestle Nick Bockwinkel in a non-title match. Okay, because I don't have time to prepare for him. The show's got to go on, and I'll give him an on-time. Well, the other thing that happened on this card was Red Bastien was also scheduled to wrestle against a newcomer to the A.W.A. that night by the name of Ray Stevens. And Ray Stevens had an international reputation for about 15 years. He was huge out in California as he was a heel. And the story was that when he came to the Minneapolis Auditorium, he grabbed a ringside chair during the Gagne-Bockwinkel match. And he sat it in the corner. When they asked him what he was doing, he said, I'm just scouting the two wrestlers. I'm here to get a title shot. So I'm scouting. I will point out that Ray was scheduled that night to wrestle Red Bastien. Bastien, of course, was a no-show because he was really injured. One of the few times when a real injury occurred, because he wasn't able to walk. So Ray wrestled a lesser wrestler, won his match. Then he's sitting ringside. Well, Vern's problem now behind the scenes is his original plan was to keep the title on Red and Cortez for that year and a half, 2 years. And now that is gone because Cortez is gone. So during the course of the match with Bockwinkel, Vern puts the sleeper hold on him. And Ray Stevens jumps up and tells the referee that it's a choke hold. He's choking him. Supposedly Ray doesn't care who wins, but. And when Vern let go of the hold, how dumb of him, and went over and slugged Stevens off the ring apron, Nick recovered, pulled Vern into a rolling cradle and pinned his shoulders 1, 2, 3, and here the champ lost. Non-title victory. So this built up Nick Bockwinkel. But Vern's problem was solved when he had to come up with a new tag team champion. And he did something that you'll recognize this. He got on the phone to Crusher. And he said, Crusher, I need a favor. And will you come in? Crusher had been gone for a while. He says, will you come in? Will you team with Red Bastien as champions? Crusher agreed, but there was a stipulation that we didn't know about his fans. There was a stipulation. I'll wear it, but I don't want it for very long. We're not going to go longer than 4 or 5 months here. So Vern, okay. So what happened there was Vern now says, you know what? This Ray Stevens thing and this Nick Bockwinkel thing, they kind of worked together and they had a couple tag matches together. You know, they might make good tag champions. So in January of 1972, Crusher and Bastien, you want to put them up, yep. Crusher and Bastien, so they just get to see the picture. This is an odd picture, guys. You see how big Bastien looks compared to Crusher? And I swear to you, it's the angle of the picture. Because the Crusher is obviously bigger. And it's amazing what a picture will do. But that is the only, that and about, there's only, I think, 2 other pictures of those two together. And this is actually the best one. So Crusher and Bastien, they weren't going to keep the title. Crusher didn't want it. So Vern decided he would put it on Nick Bockwinkel and Ray Stevens. And it made sense to Vern because even though he wanted to lose the title, at some point, he says, I can slow down, keep the title, don't have to wrestle as much, and I'll have a lot of main events with Nick and Ray on top. So they were the new champions. You can put them on. Ray Stevens, Nick Bockwinkel. And I can't tell you how unpopular they were. They really were good. Now, they were going to be champions for a couple of years, and it worked. So Vern decided, and originally behind the scenes, he was eventually going to lose his title to Nick Bockwinkel. That was the plan when Nick came here in 1971. He was promised a title at some point, but this made it longer. So we got to 1974. Well, let's go back first, 1 year. 1 year after they were champions, Vern still is wrestling, you know, got scores to settle with Nick Bockwinkel. He teamed up with Billy Robinson. We'll put that one up. And lo and behold, they won the title on December 30th of 1972. And they won the title. You saw them celebrating. They were so elated that they decided they were going to take a fishing trip in Alaska or someplace. But Nick and Ray wanted a rematch. So promoter Wally Carbo, he used his promotional powers and he said, you guys got to come home from your trip. You can't be out. You got to defend the title. So the first week in January, the new year of 73, they defend the title, they lose it back. But it really, again, was for the purposes of cementing Nick and Ray as the solid team And then Vern went on his way and Billy was in tag team matches with other partners against Nick and Ray, and it was just the perfect combination. Now things are gonna get really weird, guys. Okay? We get to 1974 in July. And sometimes things, and remember that deal I told you about the Von Steigers in Portland, where they weren't really champions? But how do you sit a Portland wrestling fan down and tell them that they didn't see them beat the Vachons and they win the title, and they saw them in a rematch defend the title? It happened, but not according to the A.W.A. So the Von Steigers technically are not in the listings of champions. Well, this is going to happen again in a really weird. Crusher, Bockwinkel and Stevens are in Denver, Colorado in April of 1974. And they lose a match in Denver. They lose the title to, put the next one out, their old buddy, the Crusher, and Wahoo McDaniel. Now, here's what happened. Gene Reed, who was the promoter in Denver, for the night, he kind of went into business for himself. And he had Nick and Ray drop the title to Crusher and Wahoo. But it was only recognized in Denver. The A.W.A. did not recognize or acknowledge this ever happened. And what's really weird is that though they were supposedly champions, world champions in Denver, not Nick and Ray were still defending the title in the A.W.A. cities for 2 more weeks until they had a rematch in Denver, and Wahoo and Crusher lost the title back to them. Now, the A.W.A. does not recognize that title change. Never happened. But tell that to a Denver fan, because it did happen. And I even saw, while they were supposedly champions, I even saw Dick Murdoch team with Wahoo McDaniel to challenge Nick and Ray in St. Paul. Go figure. All right. So now we're in July, 2 months later, or about 2 weeks later, in Winnipeg. Put the next picture up. Our old buddies, Crusher and Billy Robinson, win the title from Nick and Ray. And Nick and Ray are living. They shouldn't have lost the title to these 2 guys. This was a legitimately recognized championship. So for 3 months, Nick and Ray are trying to get a rematch. Promoters are telling them that we can't get the match signed, so and so. So what happens on TV in August, Nick and Ray come out and they're going to wrestle against the new team, the young team of the High Flyers, Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell. But before Nick and Ray decide to do this, they come into the ring with a manager. We've had promoters that have put contracts in front of us that we never signed. They're putting wrestlers in the ring that we never agreed to wrestle. We need a manager to help behind the scenes to make sure we don't get screwed by the promoters. And the manager is Bobby Heenan. So they're going to wrestle against Greg and Jim, Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell on this TV match. Well, during the course of the match, it ends up that Bobby Heenan gets into it. Nick, Ray, and Bobby are double teaming the High Flyers, who are just a rookie team at this point, because they both only been wrestling for about a year and a half. And a couple wrestlers come in to try and break it up. Greg is injured. Brunzell is injured. Then out of the blue, here comes Larry Hennig. Oh my God, he's going to join in on Join. The fans are talking about, because Larry didn't like the Gagnes, remember? Well, Larry had decided he was going to help Greg Gagne. He carried him out of the ring. What's going on here? And Larry had turned good guy. He said, I came to the rescue of this young kid because I didn't want to see a career ended. I have a young boy myself who may be a wrestler someday, and I didn't want to see a young career. And the fans cheered Larry Hennig. This set up a great feud with Nick and Ray and Bobby Heenan to wrestle against the new babyface Larry Hennig and whatever partners he could come up with. Nick and Ray then got the title back from Crusher and Robinson, along with Bobby Heenan's help. And it just was mayhem after that. Vern Gagne was teamed up with Larry Hennig, ironically. Greg Gagne teamed up with him. Great interviews from Nick and Ray. That Judas, that Benedict Arnold, Larry Hennig. One of the great lines that he was now Larry the Axe Hennig. Was no longer Pretty Boy. He was the Axe. And Ray Stevens gave a great interview. He was so mad. He says, Larry Hennig, he wants to call himself the Axe. It's going to his head. Well, I'm going to knock him on his axe. Little play on words. But anyway, that was the way it went. So we get about a year later, Vern Gagne is legitimate, but not even a year later. Yeah, a year later, Vern Gagne has finally decided he's going to hang it up. He's going to retire, not retire, he's just going to slow down as a wrestler, and he's going to lose the title to Nick. So before they can do that, he's got to get the title off, the tag team title off of Nick and Ray. So wouldn't you know, guess who Vern called? Crusher. I need a favor. Crusher comes, Bruiser comes in, they beat Nick and Ray. Of course, Heenan and Nick and Ray, they're all upset. Ray left the territory for a little bit there, just disappeared. Nobody even acknowledged he was gone, which is weird, but he just disappeared. And Nick was now a singles wrestler, and he got a chance to wrestle Vern Gagne on November 8th of 1975 in St. Paul. And he won. And Nick was the new champ. And Bobby Heenan is now managing the world champion, which is really great. Great crowds. Nick was a great drawing champion. But Crusher, of course, doesn't want to keep the title, remember? So Vern has to come up with some challengers. And about 4 months later, he comes up with the next team. Emily's going to show you here. Blackjack Lanza and Big Bad Bobby Duncan. Couple of cowboys, okay? Bobby Duncan was funny because he's always on his interviews chewing the snuff. You know, and Lanza was just a character. So they're the new champs. Crusher and Bruiser are gone again. And we go for 2 years. They're doing really well. And we get into 1977. And this team finally comes up against, I think put the next one up. Look at that. They're now an established tag team. The High Flyers. They win the title. Very, very popular. And you got to remember, Nick is still singles champion, so they're drawing great cards. And it made sense to have a heel champion and then good guy tag team champions. Well, what happened with this team the first time around was Jim Brunzell was playing in a charity softball game. And this is legit. And during the course of the game, he injured his leg. He got a really bad staph infection. He had to take time off from the ring. So Vern did something that he'd kind of done years before without holding a tournament or anything. You know, what am I going to do with the tag team title? So he announces, well, I shouldn't say he announced. There was this guy in Amarillo, Texas, Stanley Blackburn, who was the president of the A.W.A, the figurehead president. He made the announcement that the #1 challengers at the time were Ray Stevens, you can put that one, Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson. And they had now become a heel team, and they were going to be the ones to take it from the High Flyers because Jim couldn't wrestle it. This was great because Nick, they're both heels. They had been a team 10 years earlier out in San Francisco. And actually in the 60s, if you ask wrestling historians, they will typically tell you that the 2 greatest tag teams in the 60s were Larry Hennig and Farley Race and Ray Stevens and Pat Patterson, generally speaking. So Vern reunited them. They were champs for about a year. They were feuding off and on with both Billy Robinson and partners, and off and on with Vern Gagne and partners. And Vern would just wrestle occasionally at this point. Well, what happened in one of the matches, Vern and Billy, they wrestled Nick or Pat and Ray, and lo and behold, they injured Billy Robinson. Vern doesn't know what to do. He says, this is ridiculous, the way these guys wrestle. They break every rule in the book. I don't know what I'm supposed to do to beat them. He says, I've got an idea. I'm going to get a guy that breaks the rules like they do. Well, who's he going to get? He shows up with his mortal enemy, Mad Dog Vachon. And you can put that one up because I love that picture.
It's a great picture.
Mad Dog and Vern have always been enemies. They had never made up. And now they're going to be a team. And the deal on TV was Vern said, I don't like you, Mad Dog, and you don't like me. But we've got two people that we mutually don't like together. Let's beat them and get them out of wrestling. And the dog agrees. And then Dog says, and when we're done, you go your way, I'll go. Okay? Well, again, it's that scenario with the fans. How can Vern team with this guy? How can he trust him? He's going to end up in the ring with 3 opponents. Well, amazingly, they won the tag team title. Well, now we got to stay together. We don't want guys like Ray and Pat to have it. So they stayed champions for a year. And they had various matches with other teams and rematches with Ray and Pat. Then in June of 1980, Vern Gagne in Chicago decided behind the scenes that he wanted to be champion one more time, singles champion. He was thinking of actually retiring from the business. He's now approaching 50 years old, give or take. And he, for his own ego, now let's keep this in mind, he owned the company, and yes, he could make himself champion. But never forget that he was a real, legitimate amateur wrestler. And he had the credentials that if he wanted to beat somebody and he didn't want them to win, he could break off their arm, hand it to them, and they wouldn't know he took it off. Okay? So Vern was the real deal, even at his age. So he won the singles title from Nick in June of 1980. And Vern made the announcement right away. He said he was elated to be champion again. He said, I'm getting older, the victories are tougher. This is like a Hollywood movie scenario playing out here, kids. He says, you know, and it's getting tougher and tougher for me. And he says, I am going to retire when I lose my next match. Okay, if I lose, I'm retired. I'm done. We get to 1981, and he has wrestled John Studd, Big John Studd. He has wrestled Big Jerry Blackwell. He has defended the title a time again to Nick. He's come through it. Finally, he says, you know what? It's time. I'm going to retire. It's just getting too tough. He's playing this out on the air. It's getting too tough, and I want to go out. He says, I'll defend the title. So who gets the title shot? Nick Blackman. And this was going to take place on May 10th, 1981. Governor Al-Quee in Minnesota declared it Vern Gagne Day. The match took place at the St. Paul Civic Center at ringside, and I want to tell you there were 20,000 people. Okay, this was legit. Vern Gagne was going to defend his title that day. Win or lose, he was retired. Nick right away says, I'm going to destroy his retirement party and I'm going to beat him. I'm not only going to put him out of his misery, he's going to lose the title. Well, at ringside, Vern had all his college buddies, Billy Bye, Bud Grant was there from the Vikings. Rudy Boswich, who was a Minnesota senator at the time, was at ringside. A lot of other notables that were Vern's friends. And the match went, guess who won? Vern. All of the Crusher, Larry Hennig, different good guys on the card, they carried him out. He retired as champion. Well, now we got a problem. We don't have a world champion. Well, Stanley Blackburn, our great president, he said, you know, I've reviewed this with the championship committee, that fictitious championship committee. we realized that we need a world champion. Promoters have matches signed. We can't have a long, lengthy tournament. So because of his former record as champion and his #1 contender status, we are awarding the title to Nick Blackwell. Nick is elated. This was not a popular decision with the fans because generally speaking, the word around town was they should have had an elimination. Sure, they should have had a short tournament and Nick should have earned it. So that's what the fans are saying. Well, Vern came up with a genius idea because they're really upset with this decision. It just so happened that a guy by the name of Sheikh Adnan Al-Casey had come to the territory just 2 months earlier. And he had become really hated. Baghdad, Iraq. We had Iraqi issues even back then. And he was here to challenge for the title and he wanted to wrestle and he wanted to take the title back to Iraq. So Vern, true story, he decided that if I put Nick in the ring against Sheikh Adnan Casey, that may take the pressure off of Nick having the title handed to him. The fans would cheer America over Baghdad, but he still had one problem, Bobby Heenan. So before the match started with the St. Paul, and this was in the Minneapolis auditorium, Bobby comes out with Nick, the Sheik comes out, booing, fans are booing both. The Sheik went after Bobby Heenan, took out his sword, hit Bobby Heenan, supposedly busted him open. Bobby's laying there, and they carried Bobby out. So Vernon just eliminated the one denominator that would possibly, if by some slim chance the fans would have sided with the Sheik instead of Nick. So Vern was controlling the emotions here. Well, now Nick, and we were there, the fans are yelling, USA, USA, and Nick was the babyface. And they had a couple of rematches after that. Nick was able, they kept Heenan out of it all 3 times. And when it was all done, the Sheik didn't win the title, but he was now wrestling against Baron von Raschke, who had somehow just conveniently been the referee in his last Nick Bockwinkel match and caused him to lose. So he had to get revenge with Baron von Raschke. And now Nick was back being booed. He could wrestle against Billy Robinson and the rest of the babyface challengers, and the Sheik could go on his reign of terror. So that's how that worked out. But with Vern retired now, let's go back to this scenario with Vern retiring. Vern retires as champion, and lo and behold, remember he held the title with Mad Dog Vachon. He wins the title, and allegedly Vern, he was so excited about going on, winning this title back and being retired that he was going to go on a vacation. Well, he had a match signed with Mad Dog to defend the title in Denver against the next team that you could put up. They were going to wrestle Jesse the Body and adorable Adrian Adonis. Looks adorable, doesn't it? And Vern didn't show up for the match. And so by default, Stanley Blackburn made the decision that because they were the #1 challengers, they were champions by default. Well, Vern was retired. Mad Dog wanted revenge because he didn't like this decision. So he had many title matches with them and singles matches with them. And he'd get a different partner to wrestle with them. And he teamed with Crusher, he teamed with Greg Gagne, whatever combination he could come up with. So they are champions for about a year, doing well. And now the Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell team are back together, the High Flyers. They want to win the title. They win it from Jesse and Adrian. And they hold it, believe it or not, for 2 years, almost 2 years, Greg and Jim. Very popular. And you have the Nick as champion heel and your babyface champions as tag team. So it worked really good for the crowd. Well, what happened next was our old friend Sheikh Adnan Al-Casey. He had teamed up for quite some time previous to this with Jerry Blackwell, who he dubbed Jerry Ayatollah Blackwell. And Jerry had sold out for the money that the Sheik was paying him and giving him the harems and treating him well with the, just being the lavish lifestyle. Well, the Sheik decided because, strangely enough, the Sheik said he broke his arms and he had a cast. He had a broken arm for 2 years. And he couldn't wrestle, so he needed a tag team partner for Jerry Blackwell. He came up with a brilliant idea. Actually, it was Vern's idea, but it worked. Behind the scenes, Ken Patera, anybody that knows about Ken Patera, he was an Olympic wrestler in the 1972 Olympics. He was a weightlifter, and he got trained for the pro ranks by Vern Gagne. He had a good career, all the different territories. He was a heel, but he was still an American. Well, Bobby Heenan was managing at the time the team of Bobby Duncombe and Ken Patera. The Sheik called Bobby Heenan out on TV and wanted to talk to him. The Sheik had 2 suitcases, suitcase 1, suitcase 1, about the size of this computer here. He lifted them up, and each suitcase supposedly held $250,000. They showed the money. And the Sheik told Bobby Heenan, he said, I want to buy Ken Patera from you. Now remember, Ken Patera is an Olympic American, okay? I want to buy him from you, and I will give Ken Patera, I will give you $250,000 for Ken Patera. And I will also give Ken Patera $250,000 to come to me. Unheard of. Ken Patera comes out, Bobby Heenan says, I want to make sure I got this clear. He goes through it again. You're going to give me $250, and I'm going to sell you Ken Patera, and you're going to give him $250. The Sheik says, that's right. They made the deal, and the Sheik then had Ken Patera and Jerry Blackwell, and wouldn't you know, they were the #1 heel team at that time then. And you can put their picture up. Here's how beautiful they looked. He dubbed Ken Patera Sir Lawrence of Arabia. And then we had Ayatollah Jerry Blackwell. And you see that broken arm? It remained broke for years, but it always ended up being a weapon when he needed to as a manager. So they won the title from Greg and Jim. Well, now things are going to get weird again, because we get to the end of 1984, the middle of 1984. You guys will remember this if you paid attention, because this made the newspapers. Ken Patera, along with Japanese wrestler Mr. Saito, Masa Saito, they were in Waukesha, Wisconsin. And after they had wrestled, Ken Patera decided he wanted to go to McDonald's. And McDonald's was closed. And they wouldn't, he's knocking on the windows. They wouldn't come to the window. They wouldn't come and open. They had closed. And Patera got upset. He went out and he picked up a big boulder and he threw it through the window. They went back to the hotel, Saito and Patera. McDonald's called the police. The police come to the hotel. Patera and Saito's got a little bit broken English. I mean, he was legitimately, and by the way, he was a great amateur wrestler in 1968 for Japan. So he was the real deal, Saito was. So the police come to the hotel. They want to talk and arrest these two. Patera's drunk, not going to have anything to do with it. They start beating up on the police. Saito ended up taking out one of the lady officers. This is all in the papers. You can look this up. Well, so now guess what? They've both been sentenced to prison. Now Vern's got to get the title off of the Sheik's army here before Patera leaves. So he comes up with, oh, you guys aren't going to believe who he called. Who'd he call? Crusher. Crusher's now 50-something years old. He is actually semi-retired. Vern says, I need a favor. You got to come back here. And his next most popular wrestler at the time was Baron von Raschke, who had turned babyface a little bit earlier because he was teamed with Mad Dog, who had become a good guy. So that was some of the behind the scenes. So Crusher, be my champ. Well, it was an interim thing again, because Crusher said, I'll do you the favor, but let's make this quick. So it only went a short time, and you can show the picture of Crusher and Barrett, because it's a classic. You know, that's all the people need to know from the Crusher. How about that? There they are. Vern did a little double cross here, and fans behind the scenes did not know this. He had promised the tag team title to a new team that had come in by the name of the Fabulous Ones. And originally he had intended to have them beat probably the Sheik's, Patera, and Blackwell. Well, the Fabulous Ones were, you know, just newcomers, so they didn't get a title shot right away. So the title is on these two. And then Vern kind of broke his promise behind the scenes, because two guys came into the territory, and you can show the next one. The Road Warriors. They came in as heels, but the fans cheered them. And they cheered them loudly. No matter what the Road Warriors did, the fans cheered. It was just their gimmick. They just come in and beat up people, and it went over. So Vern decided he was going to put the title on the Road. And that ticked off the Fabulous Ones. So they ended up eventually leaving. It's, you know, screw you, Vern, behind the scenes. We didn't know that. Well, they ended up as champions. Now, Vern realized he kind of made a mistake here, because the Road Warriors, if any of you remember them from 1984, they would come to the ring, and they would be coming to the ring ready to just kick butt once they got to the ring. And when they got in the ring, they didn't wait for introductions. They just started beating on their opponents. They didn't sell for their opponents at all. They wouldn't take any, the opponents were just chopped liver to them. And that was their gimmick. And the fans cheered them. So what happens is that because they're this unbeatable team, soon we had the question was, who can really beat them and make it seem logical? Because really the fans believe you can't beat them. And you know, it really made sense that they weren't going to lose. The logic was Vern shouldn't have put the title on. He should have let them be challengers and get screwed out of winning the title through the referee's decisions or whatever would happen, disqualifications. But he put the title on. Well, then we go about a year, and the Road Warriors are champions. It's in 1985. And the Road Warriors give their notice that they want to leave. But Vern doesn't know how to get the title off. Who can I make? This doesn't make sense. So the Road Warriors had a match in Chicago against the Freebirds. Michael Hayes, Terry Doherty, Buddy Roberts, Fabulous Freebirds. And it was a big riot match. They had a manager by the name of Precious Paul Ellering. Paul Ellering had been a wrestler 10 years earlier, trained by Vern Gagne. Paul Ellering was a bodybuilder. And then he went on and had a short career. He wrestled for a while, but then he became a manager. And he was a heel manager originally with them. But he was a good guy with them. So we had the Freebirds against them in Chicago, and this match got out of control. The very next night in St. Paul at the Civic Center, they were signed to defend the title to a team that nobody in their right mind would ever believe could beat the Road Warriors. And it was a team of gorgeous Jimmy Garvin and Mr. Electricity, Steve Regal. Now, neither one of them were in the class with these guys. Vern come up with the idea how to do it. During the course of their match, and show the next team, there's Garvin and Regal with their manager, Precious, just Precious. Little story on her. It was Jimmy Garvin's wife, Patty. That's who she was. And she used to come to the ring. She was obnoxious. She'd be spraying this aerosol in people's eyes, you know, spraying the ring. And she was just a pest, but it worked. It was a good gimmick. And Steve Regal was basically a junior heavyweight. So there was just no logic that they would beat the Road Warriors. But the Freebirds came to ringside that night. They wanted revenge against the Road Warriors from the night before. was one of the few times when they actually acknowledged something that happened the night before. And the Road Warriors were there. They are now against 5 wrestlers: Garvin, Regal, Hayes, Gordy, and Roberts. And as it turned out, the Freebirds got into it. Jimmy Garvin got a pin over Animal of the Road Warriors while Hawk was being 5-teamed outside, and the Road Warriors lost. But it made sense. Everybody still said they shouldn't be champions, but you got to agree with the way Vern pulled it off. 5 guys beating him was the only way he was ever going to beat him. Okay. So now we've got those guys as champions for a while. Lo and behold, remember Larry Hennig come out after he saved Vern Gagne, and he carried Vern out after that beating from Nick and Ray and Bobby Heenan. He says, I had to come to his rescue because I have a son, may wrestle someday. Well, now about 5 years in, Larry Hennig's son, Kurt, is wrestling. He's no longer a rookie. And he had joined forces with this next guy, Big Scott Hall. And Vern put the title on him. The logic being that Kurt is a hometown boy, so he's not going to go anywhere. Scott Hall was the next best thing. And I will just tell you that about a year before this, wrestling had changed drastically because Vince McMahon in New York had decided he was going to go national in promoting. And he took Hulk Hogan from Vern Gagne and a lot of other wrestlers. He also took wrestlers from a lot of the other territories to make his expansion efforts work for pay-per-views and that sort of thing. So Scott Hall was kind of the next guy that was big like Hogan was. He was tall. I think they built him at about 6'8". He was legitimately tall. And he had the Tom Selleck look at that point in time for, remember Magnum TA or Magnum PA? Tom Selleck. And that's what that was. So they became champions. Well, things were rocky in the business because of that expansion thing. And eventually, Scott Hall was going to leave. And they ended up losing to the 2 next guys you could put up there. Pretty Boy Doug Summers, Playboy Buddy Rose. Buddy Rose was trained by Vern Gagne about 11, 12 years earlier. Paul Pershman out of St. Louis Park. Vern trained him. Excellent wrestler. He was a great young kid. And he ended up going into the business and changing his name to Buddy Rose, Playboy. His gimmick was, you see, he's a little bit heavy there. He ended up getting even heavier, but his gimmick is that he said he weighed 217 pounds. The reality is that he was about 271 pounds. So the gimmick is when they introduced him at 271, he would go ballistic and tell them, I'm 217. Got over with it. Doug Summers was a journeyman wrestler at that point. He'd been around about 10 years. He got trained by Harley Race for the business in Kansas City. And this was his first time as a major champion. So Vern kind of rewarded him. The lady in the middle is sensational Sherry Martel. She was a lady wrestler that Vern was using at the time. And she decided she was going to manage these 2 guys. So they were the latest champions. And then Vern had the perfect babyface challengers that really got over with the fans. They were kind of on the same page that the Fabulous Ones were. And they were the team of, and you can put that one up, Marty Jannetty and Shawn Michaels. And the title just went well with them. They were popular. So it went really well. But something happened during their tag team reign. Vince McMahon in New York decided, you know what, I want the Rockers out here. So he talked them into a bigger deal, and the Rockers were going to leave. So they did agree to lose the title for Vern before they left. And they wrestled the next team. And I do apologize for my name on a couple of these pictures, but they've been used for other things. And sometimes I need to mark them just for non-copy purposes. But anyway, they lost the team to Boris Zukov and Soldat Ustinov. because Vern's promotion was now struggling a little bit more because of his talent constantly being taken and Vince McMahon getting more powerful and a lot of the territories were struggling. Zukov was a guy named Jim Nelson. I guess that's Russian, right? And he shaved his head and he became Boris Zukov. This guy here, I got to think of his name. Oh my goodness.
Jim Lanning.
Thank you. I actually worked around him up in Winnipeg, Jim Lanning. Jim Lanning became Soldat Ustinov, and he had worked for Eddie Sharkey in independent promotions. So Vern put the title on. They ended up going into Tennessee, and Vern had formed a short-term relationship with the Memphis Wrestling Office, where Jerry Lawler was now kind of in the fold in the A.W.A. And he even held the singles title for a little bit, Jerry Lawler did. But Jerry Lawler in Memphis was literally, he wrestled as Jerry the King Lawler. And you know, in Memphis, there is only one real king, right? Even Emily knows who that would be.
Elvis Presley.
Yeah. But Jerry Lawler was the king for wrestling. And he had a regular partner down there he went by the name of Superstar Bill Dundee. So in Memphis, they did a quick title change where Lawler and Dundee, and you put them up. They ended up holding the A.W.A. tag team title. And it was actually acknowledged, but they never really defended it outside of Memphis. So we did hear about it, but it never really happened. And then they in turn lost it to the next team, which is, they were the original Midnight Express. I say original because there was later the copycat version. But this was Dennis Condrey and Randy Rose. And the guy in the middle, if any of you watch modern day wrestling, I don't know why you would, but if you do, on WWE, you've seen a guy named Paul Heyman. My name is Paul Heyman. Watch that. Well, that's who that guy in the middle was. He was wrestling or managing as Paul E. Dangerous. And he's now bald and fat. But that's who he was in his younger days. A little inside story on Paul Heyman. I knew him personally in the 70s. We used to exchange wrestling programs. So he was a fan like I was. He sent me programs from New York. I would send him mine from the Twin Cities. So I did. But they became champs for a while. And then Vern, because they were mostly a Memphis team, Vern was having some issues trying to get him in to wrestle. So he put the title on one of his own teams, and that's the next one you're going to see. Paul Diamond and Pat Tanaka. Medusa Michelli is the lady manager. You notice they started to use lady managers, and they weren't managers anymore, they were valets. But the ladies really got the attention for the fans because they would interfere and be loudmouth, and the other wrestlers couldn't touch them. You know, who's going to hit a lady? I mean, that was, you know, the male manager, the other wrestlers could go after him. But you never went after Sherry Martel or Precious or Medusa if you were a child. So anyway, they were the team. I thought it was ironic with Paul Diamond. Vern evidently had a brain lapse and forgot that he had a Paul Diamond in the A.W.A. just about 10 years earlier. So we had a real Paul Diamond and a fake Paul Diamond. But they were both Paul Diamond. And then Pat Tanaka, he was actually the son of a famous wrestler by the name of Duke Kiyomuka. He was a good Japanese wrestler in the 50s and 60s, very popular and unpopular in Texas and Florida. And that was his son. So he didn't want to use the Kiyomuka name. I guess Tanaka sounded better. So they were the next champs. But eventually, Vince McMahon struck again, and he ended up bringing them both into the WWF. And so Vern lost his champions. So he come up with an idea. We're going to go back to America here. And he decided that a couple of years earlier, our good buddy Ken Patera had served his year in prison, and he learned his lesson. He came out and he was a good guy. He saw the error of his ways, so to speak. And Vern decided he would team up Ken Patera and the All-American Brad Rangans, the Olympians,
You notice Ken didn't have the blonde hair anymore, but you're no longer Sheik Lawrence of Arabia or anything. And they were very popular for a short time. But weird, both of them hurt themselves. Neither one could wrestle. At least that's what they told us. But they didn't wrestle, and Vern had to come up with new champions again. So he had Greg Gagne team with with Paul Diamond. Paul Diamond had come back just for a spec, and all of a sudden he was a good guy. And they lost a match, an elimination match. Believe it or not, they had an elimination match. Greg Gagne, Paul Diamond lost to the next team, the Destruction Crew, Wayne Bloom, and he was called Wayne the Train Bloom and Mike Enos. Some of you guys remember them? They had a unique interview thing. They were the Destruction Crew, so they came out with the ballots. But Bloom would always do the interview, or I should say, Enos tried to do the interview. And as soon as he'd start talking, Bloom would say, "Just a minute, Mike, I've got this." That was the routine. And in a way, you were kind of waiting for what's going to happen when Enos gets upset with this. It's got enough of this, but they never did that. So he ended up being the talker. Well, while they were champions, our old buddy, Vince McMahon, believe it or not, struck again. He decided he wanted the Destruction Crew to come to WWF. But weirdly enough, he didn't want Mike Enos and Wayne Bloom. They disappeared. And all of a sudden, there was this blonde, strutting, cape-wearing combination, the Beverly Brothers, Bo and Blake. And that was Enos and Bloom. Okay? So, this is the last tag team that Vern officially had before the promotion was in trouble. We're in 1988, 89. He's got wrestlers that are coming in that say they'll come in, they don't come in. He's got wrestlers that come in that leave before they're supposed to leave. He tries to plan some sort of a series of matches. Vince is taking wrestlers are going other places. Eventually, Vern is losing money. He's not in the Civic Center anymore, not in the big arenas around the country. Vince McMahon is now going around the country. And this is the behind the scenes thing that people didn't know. Vince would go into the arenas and pay them to not rent the auditorium or arena to Vern Gagne or any of his other promoters in the A.W.A. He'd pay them to not rent. And then Vince started buying up the TV time in the different cities. Now, wrestling without TV promotion, it doesn't exist, folks. You've got to have that TV show to get the fans to want to come to the arena by their interviews and what they do in the ring. So Vince McMahon was also paying TV stations. True story. And before you know it, Vern and all these other promoters around the country, they're just getting closed out. And Vince, he's winning the battle. So in the last couple of years, watching the A.W.A., these were the last official champions. However, things got really goofy when Vern put Ustinov with Doug Summers briefly, dumb things in a title match. Memphis had a match with a guy named Hector Guerrero and Carl Styles winning, which meant nothing to anybody. These were wrestlers nobody even ever heard of. It just got really, really bad. And the final blow came when Patera and Rangens were champions. They had lost to Bloom and Enos eventually. And then we had one last team. It was the Trooper, which was a gimmick Vern came up with, a guy named Del Wilkes. Del Wilkes and his Trooper guys had the highway patrol type cap on, the police officer, and he would give out tickets to the bad guys in the ring. I mean, how ridiculous is this, And he was the Trooper. And his partner was a rookie wrestler from Kansas City, Dennis Peterson. He went by DJ Peterson. He was very green in the ring. He didn't have much to show for, but they were the very last champions of the A.W.A. And I'm telling you, there's no pictures that exist of these last two teams together. If there is one, I've never seen it. And myself and others have searched. So we don't have pictures of the last two teams. But Vern closed the door, locked it for the final time in the A.W.A. in early '91, when the A.W.A. was. It was a legacy that had ran for 30 years. We started in 1960 and went through all these tag teams. And I will tell you that, you know, as you've heard me talk in other stories, there's a lot of things that we can share on gimmicks and masks and angles and stories and feuds and characters. And so hopefully we're going to do those in future visits. If the History Center is kind enough to ask me back.
We will.
Thank you. Else to do. And if you guys have nothing better to do, you know, bring a friend next time. But with that told, we've got a few minutes left. I do want to remind you of the offer on the books. If you do decide to buy the books, you're helping the Washington County Historical Society. And that's important to me. And if you're not a member, consider being a member. I mean, it's well worth it. You'll enjoy it. There's lots of things going on too. That said, I would like, because you have all been so great, I would like to open it up. If you have a question, something I've mentioned here before, whenever, or if you have something you've always wondered about, go ahead. I'm ready. Raise your hand first so we don't all talk at once. And if nobody says anything, then for the first time in my life, I'm done 15 minutes early.
Now, I grew up with Bulldog Bob Brown,
Yes,
but I was in Iowa at the time. Is that A.W.A? No.
yeah, well, I can tell you about Bulldog Bob. Bulldog Bob Brown was a Kansas City wrestler. Believe it or not, he was trained by Vern Gagne. He got trained for the pro ranks. He was from Winnipeg, Canada. And Vern trained him in 1960. And Bob Brown wrestled around here in a lower card capacity for about 3 or 4 years. But his name was Bill Green when Vern used him. He's the only wrestler that ever, I always said, was the only wrestler that never changed his name, just his color. From Brown Beer.
Nice.
I know, keep my day job. But he was a huge wrestler in the Central States territory.
Central States.
Kansas City, Iowa,
Yeah.
that area. And big main eventer. He was huge in Vancouver, Pacific Northwest, Bulldog Bob Brown. I have an interesting story about Bob Brown. I'm going to share this with you since you brought him up. See, this is planned. I was up in Winnipeg, and believe it or not, I was doing a TV show, wrestling TV show up in Winnipeg. I was the TV host. I was the Marty O'Neill. And our main event at the Winnipeg Arena was going to be Bulldog Bob Brown against Bruiser Brody. You guys know Bruiser Brody. That was the main event. Well, I go into the locker room and there's Bob Brown. This is one of those times when you might pray for blindness. I go in and the benches that are in the locker room. He wasn't naked. But he may as well.
Didn't say anything.
He's sitting on the bench. He's sitting on the bench, obviously bare chested, and he just had his underwear on, sitting on the bench, and he's like this. That's it. I thought he died. I said, Bob. And it was like in a trance. So he got up. I have a suit and tie on. We're supposed to do an interview for this match. Bob was going to do the interview with me. It was the only time in my life that I wished I'd have brought a change of clothes. I never had a man spit on me so much. I told my wife, I said, my tie, my suit, my shirt. And he's pointing his finger at me and says, you don't know anything. You're just an announcer. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. And he's spitting. So that's my story with Bob. But he was a big Central States wrestler, teamed with Bob Geigel, who you saw tonight. Bob Geigel was one of his main partners for many years.
Rufus R. Jones.
Rufus R. Jones.
Great train.
Yep. Rufus Howard, Railroad Freight Train Jones.
But that
He
was
was-
Central States or.
Well, he worked up here for a little bit too in 1978. Rufus Jones did. He didn't really get over very well, but he was popular. I could never understand his interviews. I think he was mumbling "Save the bones" for Rufus Jones, but it never came out that way. I don't know what he was saying. So, yeah, two good memories, but they all worked here. Yeah,
Could you tell us a little more about Wally Carbo? I mean, I know Vern was a local guy and Marty O'Neill did other sports besides wrestling. I don't know much about Wally Carbo.
Wally Carbo, go back to the early 50s. He was a referee for promoter Tony Stecker, who was the Minneapolis wrestling promoter. Minneapolis wrestling had been around since after World War, well, actually before World War II. But after World War II, we were under the NWA National Wrestling Alliance umbrella in Minneapolis. And when I say Minneapolis, I'm talking all these other cities like I talk about, but it's called the Minneapolis Territory. So anytime a wrestler would come through here, they would say, I went up to Minneapolis, because it was the headquarters. So Wally Carbo was originally a referee for Tony Stecker. And then he became for Tony Stecker. And I will point out that Tony Stecker's brother, Joe Stecker, was an old 1920s 30 wrestler, who was again one of those real deal wrestlers that if you wanted to get cute with him, you'd get your arm handed because he could break your ankle or snap it just like that. They knew how to shoot on him. So Joe Stecker was a good wrestler. But Tony was the promoter. Wally then became the matchmaker, which in essence is another promoter. The matchmaker would put some of the matches together for the upcoming cards. And then Tony died in 1954. And his son, Dennis Stecker, took over the promotion. Wally Carbo stayed on. They became joint promoters, Wally and Dennis Stecker. They were promoters here until 1959, when Dennis and his family, the Stecker family, they wanted to get out of the wrestling business. And Dennis was, of course, younger. He didn't want it. So Vern Gagne, being the Minnesota wrestler all through the 50s, whenever he came here, the marquee at Vern Gagne, attendance went up. Just believe that, because it's true. And Vern decided he was going to buy the promotion. So him and Wally Carbo, 50-50, bought the Minneapolis Wrestling Club. Actually, it was the Minneapolis Boxing and Wrestling Club. The boxing was kind of on the back table. So they bought the wrestling club. And from September to August of the next year, they were under the NWA umbrella. And some of you guys have heard this before, but Vern was going to take over the territory, of course. He wanted to be champion. And the reason he had left the NWA was because he could never get Lou Thez, who was perennial NWA champion. Lou didn't want to wrestle Vern. The reason being he didn't want to put him over. And they were both excellent wrestlers, but he just didn't want to admit that Vern could win a match. So behind the scenes, even though it's not real, Lou wouldn't put him on. So Vern was going to make himself champion. He was legitimately had the credentials, as we said. And in August of '60, the AWA was formed. Vern was the first AWA champion. And then that took us to where we started with our Tiny Mills and Stan Kowalski. Vern had gotten together with a lot of his friends when he started the AWA with Wally. He got a hold of Haggerty and Stan Kowalski, Leo Namalini and Wilbur Snyder and Joe Scarpello and Gene Kaniski. All these guys were his friends, and he said, I need you to come. You're going to work for me. We're going to build this territory. So Wally became the promoter, even though he was a 50-50 partner at the time, and Vern was a 50-50. We as fans on the outside, we never knew that. That was kept secret. And Wally was the on-screen promoter. He was the spokesperson. And Wally played the part really well because if you remember, he kind of stammered and stuttered through his interviews, there's going to be fines and suspensions, and, but that was Wally's job. And then, Vern never came out of well, I was gonna say didn't come out of the closet. Well, technically he didn't until into the eighties when he had retired. Then it was kind of common knowledge that he was the promoter of the A.W.A. So Wally Carbo was with him for that whole.
But I mean, did Wally really put the matches together? It sounds like Vern ran the whole thing and Wally was just a mouthpiece.
Vern and Wally originally, Wally came up with a lot of the storylines, a lot of the angles. Obviously, Vern always had to go along with it. And they had a guy in the office for a while too, in the wrestling office, Bill Casisto, who was then called the Matchmaker. And it was mostly a figurehead. Bill Casisto had been an old wrestler that legitimately hurt his back and could not wrestle anymore. He was an amateur from the U of M as well. You look him up, Kuuisto, Bill Casisto. But Wally Carbo, I mean, he was the real deal. And the wrestlers, Vern could be tough to work with as a business person. And a lot of times the boss is tough in any company. And Vern was he was the tough guy. And Wally would be the one that would kind of smooth things over. So a lot of times the wrestlers, when they had a beef or a concern or whatever, they'd go to Wally. And Wally would kind of smooth it over. They made a good team. That help you? And then Wally passed away in 1983. I actually went to his memorial service. Guys like Stan Mazlak and all the old wrestlers were there. It was huge. A lot of wrestlers were there. He was very popular. Anybody else have a question?
How, with no communication, how did they even know these guys were gonna show up the next night? I mean,
Well,
it had to be just winged it constantly.
well, that's the beauty of what this business was from the late 40s through the mid 80s. It basically was exactly what they said. It was a handshake and your word. A wrestler would agree to come and work. So let's use Nick Bachman, for example, okay? Vern Gagne and Wally Carbo had wanted to bring in Nick Bockwinkel for a while before he actually did come. And in 1970, Vern finally worked out a deal with Nick where he was going to come and work for the A.W.A. Now, what the promoters would do, there were no contracts, no written. You basically went to work just like, I don't know, I went to work at the bank I worked at. I didn't have a contract, I was just an employee there. So that's the way wrestling was. And they'd come into the territory, wherever it was, and they would kind of mutually agree how long they were going to stay. Generally speaking, when a wrestler came into a territory, and let's just use the A.W.A., it was generally going to be for anywhere from 6 months to a year to 2 years max. They would come in, they'd work all the programs through, all the feuds, whatever they were going to do. And then that wrestler would move on to another territory because he could be new character, whatever he do. Maybe he's a good guy here, he's going to be a bad guy over there. Because there were 30 territories that they had places to go. And again, we never knew about all this because, we just saw our little TV and what they told us. Fans, Wally Carbo has spent a lot of money to get Vern Gagne to defend this title here for you fans. We didn't know they wrestled, he wrestled the same opponent 3 nights in a row someplace else. But that's how it worked. And then some of you that have been here before, that I said there were mainstays, that's what we call them, in every territory. Every territory had 3, 4, or 5 guys that just were there all the time. So Vern Gagne obviously was here all the time. The Crusher, you saw, he was here, he was in and out, but he was here. Mad Dog became a mainstay from the mid-60s through the end. Larry Hennig, he was a mainstay. So you got these guys that you're always working your program around. So any new people that come into town, eventually they're wrestling against one of the mainstays. When it comes time to leave, they move on. And so it was never any written contract, it was a handshake. But if a wrestler wanted to leave, I got an offer to go someplace else, or I don't like the weather up here. A lot of people didn't want to come here because you got 8 months of winter. And if they're from the warmer states, they prefer to be in Tampa or Hawaii or California. So a lot of times they would give notice, tell Vern, I'm going to go off, and they'd fill their commitments. Now, to answer whether or not you knew if they were going to show up every night, well, again, It's like when you go to work, you get your daily schedule or your work routine, you go, you show up. What the wrestlers got every month, sometimes every 2 weeks, but they would get what they called a booking sheet. And on that sheet, they would have all the towns and cities and opponents that they were gonna have, the dates, and they knew where they were supposed to be. So then it depended on the wrestler knowing where they were in a particular program. So if Mad Dog was feuding with Crusher, well, he knew that in these next 4 towns, I'm gonna be wrestling against the Crusher. What a lot of people didn't know is when we saw All-Star Wrestling here in Minneapolis on TV, we saw the show that they were presenting here, the interviews, but they would also have an interview day where the wrestlers would all have to go to the studio, sit around all day long and cut promos for all the different towns. And it would be specific for Denver or whatever, wherever they were. And Marty O'Neill, later Gene Okerlund, when he was our announcer, they would have to cut these promos, and then Vern would send the reel-to-reel tapes in the old days, big reels, send them to Denver and to Winnipeg and Chicago and so on. And they would get their version of the wrestling. So that's how it worked. Now, when it got to 84 and 85, when Vince McMahon started taking people, Vince was legitimately promising people contracts, promising them a lot of money, giving them a lot of money. And then the word became no good in it. So then Vern, as you saw, as I was telling the story about guys leaving and having to make adjustments, it got very tough for all the promoters because you couldn't count on your guy being here and, he may not show up tonight. That legitimately happened with Hulk Hogan. Vern had built, they used to tape the matches, the cards, anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks in advance going out. So he had taped a whole slew of matches where Hulk Hogan is appearing in all these towns. Hogan went over to Japan, did a tournament over there because he wrestled a lot in Japan. And when he came back, Vince had stolen Hulk Hogan, told him, don't go to Vern, don't work for Vern, I'll pay you not to go there. I got all these big plans. I'm gonna make you the champion. We're gonna go national. The night of the week of the matches that Hogan was here in the Twin Cities, he gets a telegram, Vern Gagne does, from Tampa, Florida. And the telegram basically just said, I'm not coming back. And it was signed Terry Bollea. That's Hulk Hogan. I'm not coming back. Greg got on the phone, called Hogan. Oh, what's going on? And Vern didn't take it seriously at first. He thought, legitimately, Vern thought that Eddie Graham, the promoter, who was his friend in Florida, was playing a prank. Okay. Well, Greg said, what's going on? And Hulk told him, Vince is paying me not to come. And Greg says, well, for the love of God, we've got matches on all over here. Come in and fulfill your commitments and then go. Hogan says, no, he's paying me more money than Vern's given me to not show up. That started that whole thing. And that was going on in other territories as well, with other territories supposed Hulk Hogan wrestling. Every territory had their own version of the superstar. So the business got very ugly. Then with the TV stations not putting his show on, before you know it, there was really only WWF. And then some other smaller promotions that have tried through the years. Behind you, Mr. Haggerty, you had a question.
Couple of questions. One was there a Stanley Blackburn?
Are you doubting that when I brought him up about 3 times here, there was?
Innocent question.
I'm teasing you. Yes, Virginia, there was. Stanley Blackburn was the figure, I heard you say that as I thought. He was the figurehead president. Whenever Vern needed some serious matter taking place, like they had to look at the films of the title match or reverse the decision or whatever it was, maybe suspend someone. Stanley Blackburn was the figurehead. He really was a person. He did come in once in a while and appear on TV. In real life, he wasn't president of anything. He was an attorney who was Vern's friend, who was an attorney in Amarillo, Texas. But Vern just paid him some money to come up here and play play the boss.
Another question.
Yes, sir.
When you were starting to see the matches of the Calhoun Beach Hotel, is that kind of when things were really starting to die?
No, not at the Calhoun Beach Hotel. The Calhoun Beach Hotel, they quit filming there in 1974 when WTCM TV, which was what Channel 11 was at the time, they're Care 11 now. They were WTCN and they had their studio in the Calhoun Beach Hotel.
Okay.
And they moved to a new facility built in Golden Valley. And then a year or two later, however it worked out, they became Care 11. Actually, they were WUSA for like a coffee break, and then they were Care 11. But they did, they had the co-letters
I
WUSA.
remember they only had two tiers of seats. And the
Yeah.
camera was on, you know, 'cause
They used to
they
have,
couldn't get a big draw.
they used to have the ring.
Yeah.
They had a curtain with some bleachers in front of it, and then over here, it was L-shaped, like you say. They had like another set of 3 bleachers. And then they had the curtain, and then right here, you didn't see it when you saw the ring, but right here was where that interview area was. And that picture you saw of Jesse with Mean Gene, that was that interview area. And the studio audience, it was free tickets. They needed an audience there to put the TV on. But if you were lucky, you got to see some of these cool matches. I see the clock is at 9 o'clock and I don't want any pumpkins or anything around. We should probably say,
Sounds good.
Thanks very much.
thank you all very much.